Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 27 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Trivia time. What do George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Abraham Lincoln have in common? They all grew up in blended families. In the case of Washington and Franklin, their father's first wife died and remarried their mothers. So both Washington and Franklin grew up in a household filled with half-siblings from their father's first marriage. Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, experienced the death of his mother and his father's remarriage, so he grew up experiencing life with a stepmother. Like many 21st century Americans, these three American statesmen had to navigate the world of blended or step families. Today, Lisa Wilson, the Charles J. MacCurdy Professor of American History at Connecticut College and author of A History of Stepfamilies in Early America, leads us on an exploration of blended and step families in early America. During our conversation, Lisa reveals how and why early American men and women chose to remarry and form stepfamilies, the origins of the evil stepmother myth, and the truth about early American stepfathers, and what happened when blended families came together. Did children accept their new stepmother or stepfather? How did they get along with their new step and half-siblings? Lisa answers all of these questions and more. And since I hate to leave you hanging, let's get right to it. Please allow me to introduce you to Lisa Wilson.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Today we welcome Lisa Wilson, the Charles J. MacCurdy Professor of American History at Connecticut College. She is the author of 3 books, including Ye Heart of a Man, The Domestic Life of Men in Colonial New England, and, most recently, A History of Stepfamilies in Early America. You may have seen Lisa on the History Channel, where she was featured as an historical commentator for the original documentary, Desperate Crossing, The Untold Story of the Mayflower. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Lisa.
Thank you, Liz. Glad to be here.
So today we're going to talk about the history of stepfamilies in early America, and this is the first book I've ever read on the topic of stepfamilies in early America. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what drew you to the subject.
Sure. I think that originally I came around to this because of my previous book on manhood. I just kept running across stepfamilies everywhere and thinking to myself, no one's done this. No one has worked on this. And the more I researched, the more I found out that was the case. There was a few articles, very few done on the U.S., and that was about it. And there's so many of them that I was really struck at this kind of hole in literature. And hard to know why there was a gap in the literature. I mean, some sociologists make the same argument that there was very little research done on stepfamilies for a long time, and they wonder if that's because of sort of the overriding prejudice we still have against that family form. And particularly when we look in the past, we like to think about families as always having been nuclear and always having been intact. And that's just not the case. But of course, I'm also a member of a stepfamily. And I also was brought up in a step family, so I've always been in a step family of some sort or another. So for me, it was pretty glaring that no one had ever written about it. So that's how I got to the topic.
Now, when I think of step families, I often think that they're formed because people get divorced. But my understanding is that divorce in early America was rather rare. So could you tell us why early American men and women decided to remarry and form step families?
Sure. I mean, it wasn't divorce, it was death. People died during their marriages and then would remarry. we got to keep in mind that most of the people in the colonies were farmers, and it's very difficult to run a farm without a partner. And almost all families, at least among the white middle class, but also among the lower class to some extent, were nuclear. So if you pulled out one of the adults, the family farm just plain doesn't work. A man would remarry in order to find somebody to care for his children as well as do the domestic work that women did. And women would remarry less often, actually. If they could afford to, many of them chose not to, partly because they were concerned about legal matters and their inheritance being absorbed by a second husband. So it's much more urgent for men. They remarry very quickly, too. If you're trying to run a farm with, say, 8 children at your heels, you can imagine it just plain doesn't work without help.
I don't know where I heard this, but since you brought up farming, at some point I heard that New England people had large families. They liked to have many kids because they needed the labor on the farm because they couldn't attract indentured servants to the cold weather of New England. Is that true?
Well, they had large families compared to almost any other colony, particularly in the 17th century. It's really interesting because the normal size of families in England was about half of what the size of families were in New England. So you had maybe 8 living children to adulthood in New England, while you might have just 4 in England. And why this matters is because inheritance patterns got all screwed up as a result, because suddenly you had 8 children to provide for, not 4, and these properties that they owned in the 17th century anyway in New England were quite large, so they could divide it up. But very quickly, areas got overcrowded because there were so many people. It also puts you in a difficult situation if you were a child waiting for an inheritance, because you had to wait until your parents died. And another aspect of the demography of early New England is that people lived a very long time. So suddenly, you had people living into their 70s and young men in their 40s waiting for their inheritance and not able really to launch until they had land to do so. So it made for a kind of a difficult, stressful kind of family life. Then as the 18th century came in, things started to even out somewhat. The long-lived people were not quite as common, and the families were not quite as big. But it was really, one historian said that New England invented grandparents. And I like that idea a lot. People live long enough to see their grandchildren for the first time. So it was a very different place, no doubt about it.
You mentioned the stress of family life, and I wonder if you could tell us about what type of legal and financial implications remarriage involved. And the way I understand it is it's different for both early American men and women.
Right. Yeah, for women is the big issue. For men, remarriage is a kind of a simple decision, an obvious decision. But for women, they became legally a different kind of person if they remarried. When a woman is not married, she was in the law called femme sole, and when she married, she was called femme couvert, meaning covered woman. And you became literally covered or absorbed by your husband. So one legal commentator said you became one person, the man. And so at that point, all of your property went into the estate of your new husband. And as a result, you were very dependent on a good choice. If you picked the wrong man who was interested in using your property for his own benefit, that's something he could do. And a lot of that property was earmarked for your children from your first marriage. And so women worried about not only themselves, but also about the inheritance of their children. And so if they could afford to, often didn't want to take that chance, and instead used an elder son to do the kind of heavy work around the farm, and he would then eventually inherit. Men sometimes used their older daughters to do some of their housework, but they were much loath to do that. And I think that had a lot to do with issues of manhood, being dependent versus independent. Being dependent on your daughter was just culturally not done. And so the only solution for men was a permanent solution, and that was remarriage.
So let's look at a couple examples of how early American men and women made the choice to remarry. In A History of Stepfamilies in Early America, Lisa tells the stories of Thomas Clapp, who remarried around 1737, and Mary Fish Noyes, who remarried around 1773. Lisa, would you tell us how Thomas Clapp and Mary Fish Noyes came to their respective decisions to remarry, and perhaps what ideas they had about the type of man or woman they wanted as their new helpmeet or spouse?
Why I compared the two of them is they both left remarkable documents. Thomas Clapp basically wrote and he was former president of Yale, and he left this amazing document saying why I should or should not marry, and all the reasons for what he was thinking, which just knocked me out when I found it. And then Mary Fish Noyes, who is more well known for being the wife of a revolutionary, left also a document describing what she thought was the ideal mate. And again, the question of whether she should remarry was part of that document. So I thought they were an interesting parallel. Clapp's a little bit earlier. He is a very devout, sort of old-fashioned Puritan, and so he was looking for at what they called in the 17th century a helpmeet, a woman that could help him around the house, but also help him spiritually to some extent, be his spiritual partner as well as his domestic partner. Mary Fish Noyes actually married a minister first time around and eventually married 4 times. And she was also very devout. And although at a later period, she was also looking for a woman or a man that had some religious feelings, but she also really wanted what was a new kind of development in the 18th century. She wanted a kind of sentimental, romantic kind of marriage. She wanted to help meet, but not in that old-fashioned sense, but rather in sort of a partnership sense. So the two of them, Thomas Clapp put off marriage for quite a while for a widower, and Mary Fish Noyes did the same. She was able to support herself as basically the indirect owner of a boarding house. When Clapp looked for his ideal mate, he worried mostly that he would find a disagreeable woman, and he would pray to God, well, you know how hard that would be for me if I found a woman that was that disagreeable. So that's what he worried about. What she worried about really was her money and her estate and what would happen to her children. Would they lose their estate? Would they have a loving stepfather that would invest their property and make it grow rather than use it for himself? And she writes to Gold Selleck Silliman, the man that she eventually marries, all about this. I mean, probably pretty intimidating for him, getting a description of the ideal mate from his future wife. But she also wrote in great detail why she was hesitant about remarriage. So it was kind of a classic case of him being a little bit gun-shy, and also being, which is surprising, very much in love with his first wife. Not that that's surprising, but that would keep him from remarriage. That, in fact, his devotion to his first wife made him wonder if he'd ever be that happy again. And so he was concerned about remarrying because of that. He had married very, very young woman his first time around, and so it's very much a love match. It's an interesting comparison. I wish they had been exactly the same date, and then I could have done a direct comparison. But the way it worked out, it kind of did a good job of talking about change over time in the 18th century.
Can we look for a moment at a little bit of that change? You said that Mary Noyes was really looking for a partner. And when in the 21st century, when we think of a partner, we think of someone who's equal to us, that will help us do the chores around the house, share financial responsibility, help raise the children. What does a partnership look like in the 18th century? And why was it such a new phenomena?
Well, it's funny. I go through this a lot thinking about this because there was definitely a change in language during the 18th century about how people write about their relationships. And as time goes on, they become, by the end of the 18th century, much more sentimental in their ways of talking, much more talking about romantic love. But I'm not altogether convinced that people weren't romantically in love prior to this time period. I mean, you can certainly find examples. John Winthrop is probably the most famous one, but there's lots of examples of marriages that go back to the 1400s in Europe, for example, that are clearly romantic. So I think what we see in the end of the 18th century is a new way of speaking and maybe some change in behavior. And this is mostly, it's almost entirely among those who can afford to think about these issues. So we have the white middle class, and that's part of what's going on as well. Is you have the rise of the bourgeoisie in Europe and the middle class here, and they start to self-define. They want to make themselves a distinct group, and many of them define themselves in terms of their families and how those families interacted. And that's part of what you hear with a different kind of language. But I think that, but love, I think, has always been part of the mix. I think money has always been part of the mix. And I think it remains that to the present day.
So in addition to the legal, financial, and emotional ramifications of remarriage in early America, there also seem to have cultural consequences. So early American society seemed to be very concerned that a widower might remarry the evil stepmother. So Could you tell us where that evil stepmother myth or concern came from and how it developed?
It's very interesting in its longevity. I mean, it's kind of frightening in how common these stereotypes are still used today. But there's a book that came out not so long ago about ancient Greece, finding evil stepmothers in ancient Greece. And there's an article from a previous author that talks about ancient Rome and also the same tradition. So in Western culture, and I can't speak beyond that, I think it goes back to the roots of the ancient world. And you can follow versions of this straight through, the European history to the time period that I'm studying. What varies a bit as the 18th century progresses, I argue, is that you start to find a comparison being made between the ideal sort of mother, and she has become quite an important figure in family life. As the sentimental family, the romantic family becomes important, the mother becomes the center player, the person who runs the household, the person who is the center of this child-oriented household. And so that mother figure is already exaggerated, and of course it has more than normal meaning. So you have this exaggerated ideal mother, and I argue that increasingly stepmothers are compared against that ideal mother. So you've always had the evil stepmother. There's nothing new with that cultural ideology. But what you do get that's new is this comparison. So you start to find, in some ways, that mothers are free of evil behavior, and the evil behavior of mothers becomes absorbed by stepmothers. I mean, my favorite example of this, and the one that knocked me out, is not something I discovered, but that literary scholars have discovered, is looking at fairy tales. And particularly if you look at the Grimm's fairy tales, like Snow White or Hansel and Gretel, if you look at the early folk tales, they actually had evil mothers in them. They were doing evil things to their kids. But then as the time goes on, and then by the time they revised the tales in 1812, at the end of the 18th century, they have revised those tales to be evil stepmothers rather than mothers. It's almost as if they can't sell the book if the mother is the evil character. And you need to have good mothers and you need to have bad stepmothers. And so in some ways, I think it gets more solidly codified, I think, during the 18th century. But this spring, I don't know if you've seen the advertisements, but we got a new Cinderella coming out, as if we need another. This one is another Disney one. It's real characters and not cartoon characters, but it's alive and well, so hasn't changed as much as I would like it to.
Yeah, you beat me to the punch, because I was just going to say, last night I was watching television with Tim and we saw the ad for the new Cinderella, and it still has the evil stepmother in it, and it's the 21st century. So, I mean, is there ever going to be a point, or was there ever a point when society let up on stepmothers?
I'm just in awe of the kind of continuity of this. I think it's a long way off. I really do. I think maybe it has to do with powerful women and people's ambivalence about that still in the present. But stepfathers are also not looked on in a positive way still. Most people, it's the kind of thing where, people say, oh, you're in a step family. Oh, there's this moment of, that's sad for you, And we talk about broken families, and we talk about versus intact families. And, there's a sense that they've got to be pathological and that the people in them have to be that way. And so I did this one thing where I looked at all the recent hits for New York Times for stepfathers, and almost every single example of stepfathers mentioned in the newspaper were about murders or sexual molesting of children.
Wow, that's depressing.
It's shocking, And it's like the word doesn't even get used except with evil connected to it. You certainly can find the same. You can find the same kind of thing in the 18th century, except stepfathers are feared because of their economic power. That disappears in the 1840s with the passage of laws that allow women, married women particularly, to own their own property. At that point, there's a shift in how stepfathers are seen as negative, and then they become potentially abusive. And there's actually research that's been done to show that stepfathers are no more abusive than natural fathers. So it really is, it's about culture. It's not about reality.
Well, let's look at an 18th century stepfather. I think we need to talk about the story of Silas Deane. Now, I did some research on Deane last year because I visited the Webb Dean Stevens Museum in Wethersfield, Connecticut, and I wrote an article about it for the Journal of the American Revolution. And, my understanding of Deane, and I only looked at his political side, was he was an important forgotten founding father. The Continental Congress basically tasked him with being the official, unofficial representative to France. And while there, he used his credit to acquire and ship war materiel to the colonies, which they used to win the Battle of Saratoga. But later, Congress and Deane have a falling out. Neither party handles it well. But, I mean, his deeds are somewhat heroic. But his deeds as a stepfather, as you describe them in your book, are anything but heroic. So could you tell us about the domestic side of Silas Deane and why some married men really feared that they would die and their wives would remarry a man like Silas Deane? Yeah,
it's a weird story. It's a sad story. I mean, as you said, Deane was a revolutionary. He also, though, spent his entire second half of his life trying to clear his name because the Continental Congress was convinced that he had used position in France to his own financial advantage. And he looked through his papers and spent years trying to clear his name, which he did in that case, but not till after his death. And the same thing happened with his stepchildren. And his battle with his stepchildren was not resolved until after his death. And in that case, it was resolved by the court that he had embezzled the estate of his stepchildren. But he never, during his lifetime, admitted to that. In fact, he accused his stepchildren of having, as he called it, the basest ingratitude to all that he had done for them. And it just is a classic case of a woman who married, probably pregnant. She was a widow and had quite a bit of money from her first husband, who was a West Indian merchant. And Dean was her lawyer, was trying to help settle the estate. And apparently they got romantically involved, and she married before she had her child. And he quit being a lawyer at that point and became a merchant as well. What he did is a couple things. First, they wrote a prenuptial agreement, which was not uncommon among widows, particularly because they were so aware of their economic vulnerability. So he probably wrote a prenup. If you look at the prenup and you follow it through, you realize that, in fact, it seems to be in her favor, but in fact it provides more or less an untouchable slush fund for Dean. He then goes about, over the years, buying and selling property, using the orphan's property and selling it and buying it in such a way that he creates deeds that are in his name. And he, in terms of personal property, that is property that wasn't land, he seems to have just used it as his own. By the end, there's not a penny left. And as the court said, it just seems to have disappeared. And so and this is over many, many years, slowly bilked the estate. But he, to the end, swears that he did do, oddly, some nice things for his stepchildren. His Samuel Webb, he helped get him started in mercantile adventures, and he doesn't seem to have been mean to his stepchildren until the very end, when he, according to the court, went in as his wife is dying, and he eventually asks his stepdaughter for any papers that mom has left, because she was left alone in the house with her mother dying, and was told to hold on to all the papers and not give them to anybody but her brother. But she trusted Silas, and he wanted the papers and said there might be something in them that will have something to do with her funeral, which is such a lousy thing to say. And at that point, this young daughter, who's about 12, gave all the papers, all the deeds that the mother had been holding on to, with the hope that somehow she could keep them for her children. When you read it through the material, it's incredibly detailed and fully described, so that you can actually follow the process of what people worried the most about, which is that a widow would marry an unscrupulous man who would then slowly or quickly use the estate to his own benefit. And Dean is one of those people that has left a paper trail that allows us to follow exactly how that happened over time.
So we've looked at evil stepmothers, and we've looked at the equivalent of an evil, for lack of a better term, stepfather. Did you find anything about how stepchildren received their new stepparents, whether it be a mother or father?
Yeah, they seem to have varied, I think they all had in the back of their mind the cultural ideas that they had been brought up with, either through reading or through conversations, sometimes with servants in the household, sometimes with their families. But they were ready to be skeptical. And so you would often get the kind of response, well, gee, they get along, what a surprise, because its expectation was that they wouldn't. But on occasion, they didn't get along. And a lot of times that was because, there's obviously personalities and so on, but there was often a cultural nut that could not be broken. One example is I've one story where the older son of a family is away learning how to be a lawyer, and so he's not anywhere near home when his father remarries. He then writes very formal letters to his father and to his new stepmother, and the new stepmother is a bit put off. And his father says, "Please write to her and be supportive." And he writes back and says, "Well, I can't write to her as anything other than a friend because I had a mother and she's gone, and that name is sacred to me. And so I can treat her with respect, but I cannot treat her as my mother." At that point, his stepmother stopped writing to him, and they literally never met. He died before he ever met her. So he was responding to the cultural idea of a stepmother, not a human, because he'd never met her. So, he was primed to not want to like her. So I think that culture pushed the negative, and yet on occasion there was quite loving relationships between stepmothers and their stepchildren. Didn't find as much on stepfathers, which was very frustrating to me. But I think that's because culturally the stepmother is so much more important with the change in the family structure.
And what about relationships between half and step siblings? In your book, you talk about the stories of James and Benjamin Franklin and John Singleton Copley and Henry Pelham. So what can those stories tell us about the relationships between half and step siblings?
Well, I was kind of surprised in what I found everywhere. I found it in fiction. I found it in actual relationships. I found it in court records that step relationships, half step, whatever relationships in these complex families tended to go pretty well, or at least they were expected to. They weren't always perfect, and I have a couple examples of that, but it's very clear that was the expectation, that these children should all get along, and that there was quite a few times when they did. I was most surprised by the probate records I looked at it in one town in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, where you can actually follow two things. One is remarriages among men if they stayed in the town, so it's a small crew, but you can follow their remarriages, and then you can take those remarriages and move backwards in the records to see basically absolutely a stepfamily, someone you can absolutely say remarried and had children, and here they are. So I could follow the wills backwards from that original marriage record. Kind of complicated, but what I came up with is wills that describe these families and how they worked the death of a family member. And it was remarkable. They had no clear sense whose property was who sometimes. They would help each other. Sometimes they would take on a stepmother because there was no one else to take her on, and they were stepchild. Sometimes they'd give up property so that they could support a half sibling. I mean, it's remarkable. It's much more as if the family folded in on itself and healed and became a, quote, intact family again. That was where I saw the most positive kinds of interactions, was among the siblings.
Those results seem surprising. Were you surprised by them?
I was very surprised. I thought there was going to be conflict. I was trying to propose a paper at one point, and I was prepared, with having not written it, to say something about the negative interactions of stepchildren. And then I thought, I better wait till I write this. And then I sat down and realized that's not what I was finding, that there was so much more positive interaction. There was one example of a family that it's complex, and they all have this one problem with this one member of the family, and that member complains about his stepsister. But the rest of them also all complain about him, and they all say to each other, what are we going to do about him? So it wasn't that they aligned along bloodlines, but instead they aligned along concern for this one particular fellow, rather than, well, he's my full-blooded brother, so therefore I feel this way, and so on and so forth. It just didn't work that way. We're in normal kind of sibling relationships. Yeah, I'm wondering, I looked at the sociological literature, and I don't think it's quite as much the case today. I think divorce adds an extra edge that death did not do. It's always when you remarry with a divorce, you still have living relatives on the other side. You still have a mother on the other side, as well as a stepmother. So it adds a different kind of stress. So I guess that's why I found it that way, but it was really surprising.
Well, Lisa, I really feel like we could talk about this for hours, but it's already time for the time warp. Now, this is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Are you ready for your time warp question?
I am.
Okay, so as you may know, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Abraham Lincoln had all been raised in a stepfamily situation. So I would like to know, in your opinion, what might have happened if Washington, Franklin, or Lincoln had not been raised in a stepfamily situation? Do you think their history or the history of the early United States might be different?
That's very interesting. I think maybe with Franklin. I mean, Franklin, battled with his stepbrother quite a bit. He was his apprentice and printer. When he had those battles, he ran away and went to Philadelphia and began his own print shop, masquerading as a full-fledged printer, and the rest of it's history. So I wonder if he would have run away if it wasn't for the step relationship. Of course, as we said, most step siblings got along. That's an interesting thing to think about. I mean, George Washington, it's interesting to think about his stepbrother, who he was so very close to. And they both went at one point to Barbados to try to get the older brother healthy again, and he didn't become healthy. But it's likely that Washington contracted smallpox when he was there, and as a result was sterile for the rest of his life and never had children of his own. I think that's an interesting little thing to think about. I mean, it's all a house of cards, really, but it's interesting to think if the step relationships had been different, what would have happened differently in the interim. I didn't know about Abraham Lincoln. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that his stepmother actually taught him his love of books.
Oh, okay. That's very interesting. That's a little later period than me. What you have is families, in effect, step or otherwise, that have been mended, which they had to be. And so then it becomes a question of how people behave within those families. And I think that step relationships for both George and Benjamin were very important and really defined their lives. They followed after their older sibling, which happened to be a step-sibling, or a half-sibling in the case of George Washington. Oh, and actually Franklin, too. It would be half-sibling. Well, now you're going to make me think about this.
Well, we'll be thinking about it right along with you. Before we conclude, would you tell us about what aspect of history you're researching and writing about now?
Yeah, I'm doing a project on, I'm calling it something like Imperial Women, and looking at Atlantic history and trying to reassert the place of women in that history, and also at the same time to try to make the Caribbean central to how we think about particularly the 17th century, and what we often end up with is 13 colonies, when in fact the Caribbean was much an essential part of the story as these colonies. I found one brochure that said the options for you to come from England to the New World are New England, Virginia, Bermuda, and Barbados. The islands were just as central as what we think of as, say, Plymouth and Jamestown. So that's what I want to do is do something with the women in those places and try to do some comparisons.
Will there be any comparisons with the mother country? Because if you think about it, Great Britain is portrayed as a woman, and she ruled it all for a while.
Yeah, I mean, and so was America.
Yeah.
Is represented as a woman, as a Native American woman. So, yeah, I mean, that was one of my great findings about the Revolution, that we had stepmother England, which was basically not a remarried woman, but rather an evil woman. So what had been a loving mother country became an evil stepmother during the Revolution. I don't think I'll ever leave my stepfamilies too far behind.
And where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
Probably the best place is the Connecticut College website. And all you have to do is search for me on that website, and I have a little details on my work and what I've been up to. And you can always contact me via email.
And you won't even have to search for her because we'll have a link to her webpage on the show notes page for this show. Well, Lisa,
Terrific.
I very much enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Fairy tales from our youth had prepared us for the existence of evil stepmothers, a concept that appears live and well in our own 21st century. But were you prepared for the fears that early American men and women harbored about evil stepfathers entering their families? Were you surprised by how well it seems that most step and half-siblings got along? You can find information about Lisa, her book, A History of Stepfamilies in Early America, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode. You'll find it all at benfranklinsworld.com/027. Do you love this podcast? Please help support Ben Franklin's World by telling your friends, family, and fellow history lovers about us. In addition to leaving ratings and reviews, word-of-mouth praise is the best way to help us make Ben Franklin's World visible and findable for new people. Finally, if you could rewrite any fairy tale for the purpose of recasting its evil stepmother with an evil stepfather, which fairy tale would you rewrite? Share your answers by sending an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com or tweet me @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.